In this video, I'm going to show you the miter saw table hack with the integrated T-track clamping system. Now, I made this to bolt over the existing cast aluminum housing. Now, the miter saw table hack will allow you to cut really small pieces safely. This will give you a zero clearance for cutting. This is actually why I built a table for a succulent planter project. You can watch that video in my channel. The pieces were like 2 inches wide and very unsafe cutting. If you decide to make a miter saw table hack for yourself, you're really going to enjoy it. You can lay your material on the table, clamp it down, and make your cuts. It's like a mini table that you can unbolt and bolt back on if you choose so. So come on along and check out the miter saw table hack project. The miter saw table hack I'm building is actually for a DeWalt 7 1/4 cordless 20 volt max miter saw. And what we're going to do is drill some holes in the existing aluminum housing. That way we can slip some bolts through. Now, you could also add threaded inserts into your wood top. I chose to use 1/4x20 hex bolts to secure the table to the aluminum housing. I'm using a drill bit guide, that way ensure a straight hole. I'm also using a 1/4 inch titanium DeWalt bit that goes through like butter. The miter saw tabletop I'm making out of Baltic birch 3/4 inch. And here I'm just measuring everything out. The bottom part of the table is actually about 24 inches wide, and plus I got some trim on the sides. So about 25.5 inches because the trim's 3/4 inches. And the width is about 10.5 inches. Most of the power tools I use now are cordless, and this is a DeWalt skill saw 4 1/4 inch. And I'm using that to rip the plywood. After I cut the pieces of plywood down to the size that I needed, I went ahead and sort of did a mock-up and laid them in place, and looking at the areas that I need to cut into the back piece. And so I'm moving my miter saw at different angles to see the clearance that needs to be cut. After I laid out all the places that need to be cut on the backsplash, I went ahead and used a Forstner bit for some of the tighter areas. That way when I use my jigsaw, it's going to be a lot easier to cut. Baltic birch plywood is more of a finer grade plywood, and I'm trying to eliminate any tear out. So what I do is I take a utility knife and pierce the top layer where I'm going to cut with the jigsaw, and it helps eliminate tear out greatly. After I used the jigsaw to cut out the clearance areas on the backsplash, I went ahead and headed over to the drill press, used the Forstner bit to countersink the holes. That way the hex heads on the bolts will sit nice and flush. After I went ahead and drilled the holes for the backsplash, I temporarily secured the backsplash to the unit. That way I can glue the backsplash to the bottom and secure it with screws. Then I will remount it and torque down the hex bolts. What I did was use 2 screws, one on each end, to secure the backsplash to the base, then dismounted the whole assembly and then put additional screws in to make sure it holds really good. As you can see, I left the hex bolts just sticking straight out. Those aren't actually screws I'm screwing in. That way I could remount it very easily to the base. And now I'm just double checking to make sure that the tabletop is square. Now it's time to lay out the T-track clamping system. And getting the router ready, I'm changing the bit on it to a 3/4 inch. The T-track is 3/4 inches wide and it'll set the depth on it. Most all my power tools now are cordless, so this is a cordless DeWalt router. And what I did is made a test depth cut. I want this track to sit just slightly below the surface. That way when I'm sliding material across the top, it will not bind up. And what I'm doing here now is temporarily attaching a sacrificial end piece, so when I'm routing the side, I won't have any tear out. As you notice, I'm also using another piece of T-track as a guide from my initial cut. So I'm cutting the 3/4 inch groove for the T-track, and I'm holding my dust collection suction right up against the router. But what I found is if I hold the suction right at the end of the channel, all the debris shot right down the channel into the suction. Now I'm just cleaning up the channel after routing, and then laying the T-track into the slot to make sure it fits correctly. Now it's time to sand the whole assembly to get prepped up for paint. Now I'm giving the miter saw table hack a 0 clearance, and how I'm doing that is I'm making the very first cut through the backsplash and the base to give it literally only a kerf width of a groove. So future cuts will be very safe and very accurate. If you decide to make your very own miter saw table hack for your miter saw, when you get to this point, do not cut all the way through the base. Yes, you'll want to go through the backsplash, but only go deep enough into the base to pass through the material that you'll be cutting in the future. Luckily, I remembered this and I did not do it, so I'm happy about that. Now you can also make your final cuts through the backsplash and the base at the very end of the project. That way you can pass the saw blade right through the T-track clamping system and the base and the backsplash. I decided to add some 3/4 inch Poplar trim to get a nice cleaner look. And I actually got to use a new miter saw table hack to cut the trim pieces, so I was really happy about that. Then I took my router and gave it a 1/16 inch round over, give it a nicer, cleaner look. So we're getting very close to finishing the miter saw table hack, just got a couple more steps left. I went ahead and decided to make the other sacrificial cuts for the 45-degree angles and the bevel cuts. Now I'm preparing the miter saw table hack for paint, so I use a TSP substitute to remove all fingerprints, debris, dust, things like that, so we can ensure a good paint. And then the next step I'm going to show you that's very important to give it a super nice shiny look. Now I'm going to go ahead and tape off the channel, that way no paint and debris get inside there. And the tape I'm using actually works exactly perfect. It'll lay down in the trough and up the sides perfectly. Now it's time to go ahead and paint the miter saw table hack. And virtually all the projects I do, I always use flat black. It's a paint and primer 1 from Behr, big box store, Home Depot. I decided to go ahead and paint the trim on the miter saw table hack. I wanted to match the theme for the rest of my workbench. Of course, that is an ongoing project called the Cyclone Workbench. It'll be done here in a few weeks. Now I'm using a whitewash technique, although it's not white. What I do is take some red paint and just wipe it over the black, and it sort of smears together and causes a really cool look. If you decide to make your own miter saw table hack, it's recommended that you actually paint the trim before attaching it to the main body. This is kind of a last minute decision, so that's why I did it this way. Now comes my favorite part, and that's adding some epoxy resin over the top of the final assembly. This is self-leveling, so you can put any streaks and any kind of white marks on it. It'll actually self-level after about 5 or 10 minutes. It's going to provide a super thick, durable finish, like bar top epoxy. I use all kinds of different epoxies in my project. System 3, Total Boat. This happens to be Moss Tabletop Epoxy. I added some glitter to my batch this time. It's actually the first time I've ever done this, but I've been kind of wanting to use this glitter that I bought. I might have put a little bit too much glitter on the main front part, but the back part, the backsplash, turned out really nice. Now I'm just putting some heat on it to take out any bubbles and imperfections. I like to cover my projects, that way I can keep out any extra debris, lint, dust, things like that. Of course, with the epoxy resin you can always sand it out, but it does help out quite a bit. The next day I applied epoxy resin to the backsplash. Now it's time to go ahead and put the T-track clamping system back in place and screw it in. The T-track that I bought didn't come pre-drilled, a lot of them do, so I had to drill these holes and countersink. That way I can keep the screws low without having my clamps interfere when they're sliding back and forth. After the epoxy resin cured, it's time to go ahead and bolt the miter saw table hack assembly back to the main part of the miter saw. The miter saw table hack has now been completed. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you make a miter saw table hack for yourself, I would absolutely love to see what you came up with. If you hadn't already subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. You can follow my projects.